Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee of Appropriations. We have three budgets to go through this afternoon, and we are going to start with the State Lottery and Gaming Agency and our analyst, Emily Haskell. Emily?
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. My name is Emily Haskell, and I'll be presenting the budget analysis for the State Lottery and Gaming Control Agency. In the budget summary on page 1, you can see the agency's budget increases by about 5% in the fiscal 2023 allowance to $116 million. General funds increased by nearly $5 million to implement sports betting. And sports betting costs in fiscal 2022 are funded with a proposed special fund deficiency of about $2 million. Special funds increase by just over 0.5% after accounting for deficiencies, with increases in lottery central system, personnel, and advertising costs offset by the decrease from the deficiency for sports betting. The first item I want to discuss is the Vax Cash promotion. In fiscal 2021, the agency used $2 million from its advertising budget to incentivize Marylanders to get vaccinated, beginning in May, with prizes awarded through July 4th, 2021. Exhibit 1 shows Maryland's 7-day average of vaccinations, with the timing of the announcement and the last day to win the Vax Cash promotion shown between the two red bars. Just this month, the governor announced another round of the Vax Cash promotion, this time encouraging Marylanders to get booster shots. The funding for this round, which also totals $2 million, is coming from federal funds from the American Rescue Plan. The promotion began last week and will finish with a $1 million drawing on May 3rd. As you can see in Exhibit 2, most of the allowance is for the lottery program, while 16% is for the video lottery terminal and casino program, and the new sports betting program accounts for 4% of the allowance. Exhibit 4 shows lottery sales and distributions. The lottery hit a new record level of sales in fiscal 2021, increasing by nearly 20% from the prior year to $2.6 billion. General fund revenues in fiscal 2021 totaled more than $630 million. On the casino side, revenues have mostly bounced back from their big pandemic dip in fiscal 2020. Exhibit 7 shows the VLT revenues and distributions. Fiscal 2021 revenues actually exceeded the fiscal 2019 level, despite capacity restrictions throughout most of the fiscal year. VLTs contributed over $440 million to the Education Trust Fund in fiscal 2021, and the Board of Revenue Estimates projects a further increase in fiscal 2022. Exhibit 8 shows table game revenues, which have also rebounded, but they're still below the pre-pandemic levels. And table games generated about $88 million for the Education Trust Fund in fiscal 2021. Moving on now to sports betting. As you're all aware, Maryland voters approved the referendum authorizing sports betting in November 2020. And then last session, Chapter 356 established the framework for sports betting operations. Application fees for licenses will fund the agency's operating expenses in fiscal 2022 through a proposed efficiency of $2.1 million. And 5% of the fees paid by larger operators will also establish a new sports wagering assistance fund in the Department of Commerce to assist small businesses entering the sports betting market. The Blueprint Fund will receive the remainder of the licensing fees, and it also receives 15% of sports betting revenues. The fiscal 2023 allowance includes $4.8 million in general funds for program operations. General funds are used in fiscal 2023 in place of special funds due to the inconsistent availability of licensing fees after the larger casino operators applied in fiscal 2022. There's also a proposed efficiency adding 40 regular positions and 6 contractual positions for the sports betting program, including compliance officers, auditors, and accounting staff. The agency has started hiring for these positions using existing vacant PINs in the lottery program. Licenses have been approved for 5 of Maryland's 6 casinos, as well as a few off-track betting facilities. Sports wagering got its start at the casinos in early December, and Exhibit 9 shows the total handle as well as revenues for December, including about $470,000 for the Blueprint Fund. January revenues increased nearly 40% to $644,000. Finally, this page shows the DLS recommendation, which is to concur with the governor's allowance. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Sorry, somehow I still don't have mute or unmute down. Delegate Beitzel?
Yeah, a question. I didn't see it on the chart there. The Rocky Gap Casino wasn't mentioned in your chart. What can you show what how it stands as far as the other? I know it's the last one down, but it wasn't. I didn't see it on the chart unless I missed that side.
For the sports betting, they have not applied for a license.
Okay. Okay. That's right. They didn't even apply for license, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Any other questions for the analyst? Okay, well, Emily, thank you. We will now turn to the agency, and appreciate you being here. I want to make sure I get your name right because you are new. So I apologize. And Mr. John Martin is the new director. I apologize for my delay. I almost said Gordon Mendicko, so I don't want to mess that up. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Corman. Excuse me. Good afternoon to the members of the Transportation and the Environment Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. I welcome the opportunity to appear before you today to present the Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency's fiscal 2023 budget. At this time, I'd like to thank Emily Haskell and the Department of Legislative Services for her excellent work and analysis of our budget. I would also like to thank Jesse Rowe and the Department of Budget and Management for their assistance in developing the agency's FY23 budget. With me today is Paula Yoakum, our Chief Financial Officer, Angela Jones, our Budget Specialist, James Butler, our Assistant Deputy Director and Chief of Staff, and Jim Nielsen, who is our Deputy Director. I'd like to begin by giving you an update on our current business across all three sectors, coming off a record-setting sales and revenue year in FY21. We are ahead of that pace as we entered into the second half of FY22 recently. Our traditional lottery business is strong for both our scratch-off instant ticket business as well as our draw game products. We continue to upgrade our product lineup with new and engaging games to responsibly grow sales and increase our revenue contribution. We're on pace to be about 4% ahead of our record $2.6 billion in lottery sales for FY21. As you know, we also regulate the casino gaming business and the emergency fantasy gaming competitions and sports wagering industries. In our post-pandemic world, we see all 6 casinos exceeding their revenue contribution in FY22 as attendance counts return to more normal numbers. Sports wagering debuted in December with the issuance of licenses to 5 of the 6 casinos. After 2 months of reporting, we've realized slightly over $1 million in taxes that support the blueprint for Maryland's future fund. We have 3 more entities, all off-track betting locations that we anticipate that will enter the sports wagering market over the next 2 to 3 months. As it relates to the FY23 budget, we concur with the DLS recommended action. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Any questions for the agency? Okay, I do not see any questions, so thank you very much. Congratulations on your easy pass to your first appearance for the subcommittee. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we will now turn to the Maryland Department of the Environment and the budget analyst, Andrew Gray. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll see on page 1 there, the operating budget summary for the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE. Fiscal 23 budget increase is $39 million, or 22.2% to $214.7 million. In terms of managing for results, the first exhibit here reflects Maryland air pollutant trends relative to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. Basic idea here is if the lines above 0% indicate that we have not met the standard. The only one here is the ozone 8-hour standard that has not been met. All these other lines reflect the meeting of the standards for all the other different pollutants shown there and time periods shown. So that's a good sign for Maryland, just need to get that ozone 8-hour standard met. In terms of exhibit 2, this reflects the child blood lead status. So what we've seen between fiscal calendar 2019, and calendar 2020 is a decrease in the number of children tested. This appears to correlate with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of people seeking less medical care during that time period. But you are seeing a decrease still in the reported exceedances of the blood lead levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter, but less than 10 micrograms per deciliter, and also for the less restrictive standard as well. So you're seeing a decrease. It's a good sign for child blood lead status. And in terms of Exhibit 3, this reflects the Public Information Act and permit data. What you see between fiscal 2020 and 2021 is an increase in the Public Information Act responses issued within 30 days. It's a good sign. The administration really focused on this, and it shows. You're also seeing a decrease, though, in the permits processed within the applicable standard time between fiscal 20 and 2021. It goes down a little bit here. The Maryland Department of the Environment noted that's interested in finding out more about that situation and why that's occurring. In terms of fiscal 22 actions, there's a proposed deficiency, 2 components. The major component here is the $750,000 in general funds for both the Water and Science Administration and Air and Radiation Administration as a result of declining special fund revenue, and this will be discussed more as the part of the fiscal 23 budget as an issue as well. In terms of federal stimulus funding, just a brief note here about the Sewer Sentinel initiative was budgeted $1 million in one-time reimbursable funds in fiscal 21. In terms of the overview of the agency spending, the coordinating offices is almost 50% of the overall spending for the agency. This reflects the $33 million for debt service for the Bay Restoration Fund revenue bonds. It also reflects $20 million for the Clean Water Commerce Act of 2021 funding, which we'll get into a little bit more, the $15 million for the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021 funding as well. And then also $11 million for operating and maintenance grants, for wastewater treatment plants upgrade to enhanced nutrient removal technology. Exhibit 5 reflects the overall budget, once again around $39.0 million increase, 22.2%. Some of the big changes here, net salaries increase around $3.5 million. It's even greater if you don't account for the fiscal 22 deficiencies, around $5 million difference between 22 working appropriation and fiscal 23. And then in terms of other components, here's the $20 million for Clean Water Commerce Act and $15 million for Tree Solutions Now Act. And then there's $602,000 increase for contractual FTEs, primarily in the water supply program. This is 10 FTEs. This is to address a workforce audit. Basically, there was a report that was done, contracted for by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, finding some understaffing in that program. So just a little bit more detail here about the increases in that funding. Once again, $3.5 million net increase once the deficiencies are accounted for across the 3 administrations. The only administration that didn't receive a deficiency in fiscal 22 is the Land and Materials Administration. Then in terms of the other changes, Clean Water Commerce Act of 2021 passed by the legislature last year, provides for $20 million in special funds from the Bay Restoration Fund, and it's used for cost-effective nutrient sediment reduction purchases. And this will include agricultural practices for the first time. The Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021, it's $15 million in special funds, also from the Bay Restoration Fund. We'll discuss that more as part of the PAGO analysis. And that's for the goal of planting 5 million sustainable native trees in the state by the end of calendar 2031, with funding going to the Chesapeake Bay Trust for $10 million, $2.5 million each to the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Agriculture. In terms of personnel data, there's no change in the regular positions, but MDE has reduced its overall vacancies and the vacancies that are longer than have been vacant for more than a year, which is a good sign, but still certainly a lot more work needs to be done in order to bring down those vacancies. In terms of the issues, the first issue here concerns the prior year actual personnel expenditures not being budgeted as requested. So last year it was identified by the Department of Legislative Services that MD did not put the personnel expenditures and allocated them correctly, in terms of the right sub-objects. They didn't reflect them in such a way that you can compare year to year the changes in the personnel sub-objects. Therefore, committee narrative was requested by the budget committees to do that for the fiscal 23 budget. That has not been complied with. Therefore, DLS recommends that budget bill language be incorporated into the fiscal 23 budget that would then restrict funding pending the proper budgeting of MDE's personnel expenditures. Issue 2 concerns special fund shortfalls, which we discussed briefly before in terms of the $3.5 million net increase between fiscal 22 and fiscal 23 as a result of funding shortfalls for Land and Materials Administration, for Air and Radiation Administration, and the Water and Science Administration. Exhibit here reflects the overall picture in terms of the big special funds that support each of these three different administrations, the Clean Water Fund, Wetlands and Waterways, and so forth noted here. On the far right of this exhibit, you see the balance for each of these funds. And the relatively low balances for all but the Clean Water Fund, supporting the Water and Science Administration, but this is artificially high due to funding coming in from the Conowingo Dam settlement that's not actually available for operating expenses. So the administration has budgeted general funds in fiscal 22 as a deficiency in fiscal 23. However, this is counter to the polluter pays principle, kind of core principle in terms of environmental law, environmental economics, of kind of incorporating all costs in terms of the cost of doing business. Therefore, the idea would be to increase the fees or change the fee structure in such a way to be able to bring in the revenue necessary to support the work that then addresses those concerns. Instead of this, once again, the administration is provided for general funds. DLS recommends the NDE comments on why in fiscal 22 and 23 is using general fund revenue to support those three administrations instead of revising the outdated fee structures that support them. And we've talked about this exhibit. Moving on to issue 3, this is the drinking water program understaffing issue. So December 1, 2021, the Office of the Attorney General issued a press release noting that there was understaffing in Maryland Department of the Environment's water supply program. This really is a concern due to the fact that Maryland is delegated authority or primacy for Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement in Maryland. The concern is that if Maryland does not provide sufficient resources and personnel for that purpose, it can potentially lose primacy, which means potentially lose funding and the authority to do that work. So not necessarily going to be the case. MDE does note that they are meeting standards, but this is a concern. This is raised by a workforce analysis performed by CADMIS group that was contracted for by this Environmental Protection Agency. 3 main reasons they found for this concern: increased workload in terms of addition of lead testing in schools, which is a laudable goal, but then expands the work that's necessary to be done. In addition, there are approximately 350 hospitals and healthcare centers that will also come into MDE's orbit in terms of being overseen by MDE once required Legionella treatment is installed. Regular positions and contractual FTE decreases over the years have compromised the program's ability to kind of fully staff up. There's a gap of around 55 regular positions and contractual FTEs in fiscal 21, which increases to around 75 regular positions and contractual FTEs by fiscal 2029, based on CADMIS's model. Finally, general program underfunding around $7.6 million in fiscal 21, increasing to around $10.2 million in fiscal 2029. So in order to address this, CADMIS provided a couple of recommendations, including filling vacancies, developing a resource investment plan with EPA Region 3. That investment plan was due October 2021, but has not been provided yet. He utilized the 4% drinking water state revolving loan fund set aside funding. So this is funding that can be used for operating purposes instead of capital purposes. It can be used for both, but you can kind of choose which one you're going to use it for. Increasing state investment in the water supply program with general funds, perhaps. And then also creating a fee system similar perhaps to Pennsylvania or Virginia in order to be able to recoup some of the costs to be able to support public water systems. As noted, the report has not come in that kind of shows the resource investment plan. DLS recommends the NDE provide the Budget Committee's resource investment plan was required and describe how the fiscal 23 budget addresses the resource investment plan and concerns with the shortcomings in the program. Issue 4 concerns groundwater protection program update information. So the General Assembly restricted funding last year, $100,000 until the submission of a report on the groundwater protection program. Very interesting science here. If you're interested in digging into the details, I've attempted to summarize this in terms of the different types of aquifers. The main idea is that Maryland's aquifers are not well understood, particularly the aquifers on the Eastern Shore that are experiencing saltwater intrusion, and then are also water can flow between them perhaps, and we need to understand more about that to understand how much can then be withdrawn safely in order to provide for drinking water purposes. Report included 7 recommendations in terms of things to address. DLS recommends that the General Assembly consider the creation of a sustainable funding source to be able to research and study and manage groundwater, and the requirement of an updated groundwater report every 3 years, which would help to understand kind of where we stand and be able to kind of get updates. In addition, DLS recommends the NDE comment on the extent to which groundwater protection program recommendations can be addressed within its existing resources. The 5th and final issue concerns Infrastructure and Jobs Act funding for NDE. A substantial amount of money is coming into Maryland Department of the Environment over the next couple of years through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. This is basically mostly going to be coming in through PAYGO funding and MDE's PAYGO program. The funding is noted here, potentially up to around $880 million through fiscal 26, federal fiscal 26. DLS's recommendation is for MDE to comment on when it anticipates receiving the funding, the timing of the receipt of the funding, whether funding will be budgeted as operating or PAYGO capital funding, whether it's sufficient information to allocate the funding where it is needed. This is addressed particularly to the drinking water revolving loan fund funding for the lead service line replacement. A lot of lead service line replacement needs in Maryland. The question is, does Maryland Department of the Environment know where exactly to target that funding in order to address those issues? Recommended actions to include that language, restricting $100,000 until the proper budgeting of personnel expenditures. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew, for that thorough presentation. Any questions for the analysts? Okay, I do not see any, so we will turn to Secretary Grumbles. Mr. Secretary. Got to unmute.
You know, I was trying to unmute, but a surprise bar just popped up and blocked me from unmuting. You'll probably ask me to mute quickly after I speak. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. It's an honor to appear before you to present our operating budget for fiscal year 23. I'm Ben Grumbles, Secretary of the Environment. I'm joined by Horacio Tablada, Deputy Secretary, and I think every committee member knows, and certainly Andrew Gray knows, that we're supported by Terry Wilson, who heads up our budget and infrastructure finance program. Mr. Chairman, I bring before you today and your colleagues a very strong and robust budget for MDE. I'm very proud of the fact that Governor Hogan has continued to provide the financial resources and strong support for the department, our operating budget, including approximately 950 employees. I would emphasize before I answer the questions from Andrew Gray that we continue to focus on improving customer service and sustainable communities so that we can meet our mission of protecting and restoring the environment for the health and well-being of every Marylander. And if I had a lot of time, I would focus on some of the highlights that we focused in on this year and for the coming fiscal year involving Chesapeake Bay and climate change and environmental justice, as well as operating in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. And one of the items mentioned in the comprehensive review by Andrew Gray was the reference to the Sewer Sentinel initiative. I would just simply say that this is a great example of the department embracing its public health mission, working closely with the Maryland Department of Health, investing in using Sewer Sentinel, this new approach, innovative approach to test for COVID virus in wastewater coming from congregate settings, public housing or prisons or college campuses. It's a very promising tool, and we're working closely with communities and cities, and also with CDC, which is going to be providing significant federal funding to continue this effort for biomonitoring to detect pathogens and save lives in a more effective way, supplementing clinical testing. Mr. Chairman, the other thing I just would emphasize is that we remain focused on not only environmental infrastructure and environmental regulatory programs, but on enforcement. Enforcement is an extremely important tool for environmental progress, and that includes increased inspections and using innovative technologies and information technologies and smart tools to verify compliance. Now, I'm not going to go through any great details because you have my written testimony, members of the committee, but I was asked to comment on some specific items. One of them that Mr. Gray flagged was the ongoing discussions about an aggregated fringe benefit accounting data model. We had agreed last year to work towards this change in the 2023 budget. We spent a lot of time on it because of the complexity of it and the lack of cost effectiveness. We could not meet the request. I'll be mentioning in more detail, but we would not agree with that request to change to that different approach, that different methodology that's being recommended. We've also been asked to comment on the increased general funding being provided in the water and science, land and materials, and air and radiation administration. As was mentioned in the DLS analysis, special fund revenues are not being collected in accounts consistent with prior year activity. That's partly due, Mr. Chairman, to the reductions in the number of facilities permitted or licensed due to plant closures or changes in the number of rental properties, reduced tire sales. Given the availability of general funds, it was decided, and in my view, a very good decision, to increase general funding in the short term to provide fiscal stability for these programs. Making fee adjustments or imposing new permit fees requires thoughtful consideration of many factors, including stakeholder input and legislative approval, and it would not have been implemented in time to meet the funding requirements of this budget cycle. So we are very supportive of how the budget provides a temporary funding through the general fund based on some shortfalls in revenue based on permit fees or reduced emissions, which translates into reduced fees. Mr. Chairman, as you and I have also discussed, the issue that's raised and we're being asked to comment on in the hearing is the staffing levels in the drinking water program. Andrew Gray included several cabinet report recommendations and including creation of a fee system. And let me just say this. Most importantly, to every member of the committee, the Maryland Department of the Environment is well-staffed. We have sufficient resources to continue to carry out our drinking water program and responsibilities. We were in the midst of going through the report that we have been supportive of, the audit that was being done for 55 states, not just Maryland. We were working closely with EPA on that document about the source water protection program. We've acknowledged that over the course of several years, the silver tsunami, retirements, the pandemic, competition from the private sector had led us to need to focus in on filling some vacancies and making some changes. We were in the process of doing that. We've been developing strategies. We are increasing our staffing. We have the situation under control. There was a press release. I would encourage everyone on the committee, if you have the time, to read my letter to the Attorney General of December 9th, clarifying some misstatements and mischaracterizations. And the bottom line is that we are moving forward. We have gone from 66 vacancies. We've gone from having 66 FTEs in the drinking water program to now 78. We're adding more. We got additional funding in the budget before you through the governor. And we also are planning to have 102 over the next 2 years. Any discussion about losing primacy or having our delegation withdrawn is wholly inappropriate. We have a strong program. That doesn't mean we don't need to realign some resources. We have a resource investment plan. The resource investment plan is due to EPA by April 1 with a final plan due in May. And we're happy to provide the committee with that. But earlier comments about you were supposed to submit a resource investment plan or you have these various problems, I think would have been resolved and clarified if sources had checked with us before issuing a press release and trying to draw attention about this concern. I would also note that we are actively in the recruitment stage. Just last week, we had a job fair with Bowie State University, focusing on bringing in new talent, new staff, particularly to deal with climate challenges that the state is going to be facing. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to say that we've got senior staff in place to help track the realignment of resources and the filling of vacancies to get to that number of 102 FTEs, while we currently have 78. I was also asked to talk about the groundwater protection study, Mr. Chairman. That's a very important effort, and you and other members, I share the view that groundwater is often our most precious, unseen natural resources. Between climate change and growth and weather extremes and saltwater intrusion, we need to continue to put more emphasis on what's happening underground. So we're committed to doing that. We determined in our report there were 2 recommendations. I was asked to comment on any recommendations that we could fulfill administratively. There are 2 of them that I would flag for you. One of them, which we're working on with Maryland Department of Transportation, is training road salt applicators on best management practices to help prevent further chloride contamination near wells. Our state is a leader. We can do more, but through MDOT and State Highway Administration with MDE support and county support, we've seen a cutting in half of the amount of road salts used for de-icing purposes. And we know that through best management practices like brine and pre-application and other technologies and strategies, we can continue to ensure public safety and mobility are not compromised while streams and watersheds and wells are protected. A couple other items, Mr. Chairman. We were asked to comment on the sources of federal funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I commend DLS for having a very thorough chart on that and where some of that funding, the allotments are going to go. We are very excited about the funding opportunities. The governor created an executive order task force on infrastructure. MDE is very active in that. We're looking at the $144 million that we will be getting for wastewater and clean water infrastructure. That will be very helpful to supplement the Bay Restoration Fund and ensure that we meet one of our highest priorities, and that is providing funding to small communities in Maryland that need to continue to move towards enhanced nutrient removal. The bipartisan infrastructure law also speaks very highly and importantly to environmental justice. And Andrew Gray referenced lead contamination. I think most of the members of the committee know that our state has a tremendous track record in the recent years on lead poison prevention, lead from paint and dust chips. But this is another issue where it's lead in drinking water. We'll be getting $52 million this year for lead service line replacement. We are going to be focusing with laser-like attention on and fixtures. I'd love to have a bounty program for lead pipe removal. We are working closely. I can say this directly, speaking directly with the top leadership in EPA to make sure that our state has flexibility and we don't have a lot of red tape, that we can move forward quickly with the funding for lead service line replacement, lead pipes and fixtures. It's particularly important for us in our schools since we do testing for lead in water, drinking water supplies in schools. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your patience. I just wanted to mention that we also have, there's the recommended action, specific action, that's to withhold $100,000 of general fund appropriation unless MDE reconfigures the departmental accounting methodology. As I mentioned at the outset, we would respectfully disagree with that recommendation. I look forward to answering any questions you or your colleagues might have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Could you just talk about that last one a little bit more? Forgive me, it's a little bureaucratic for me. Why is it something that MDE can't or won't do?
I know we've been trying to do it. I think the short answer is that it's more complicated and maybe more difficult than is anticipated. And so I would say that when you change the methodology, in coordination with other departments, Department of Budget and Management and IT, but particularly Department of Budget and Management, it's real important that we follow up and discuss some of the complications of that. I'm not sure what if the benefits outweigh the complications and the costs, and that's because that's why we aren't able to say to you, yes, we've adopted that recommendation so far.
Okay, maybe we should discuss that in a little bit more detail with the right people, because DLS is not usually in the habit of recommending a withholding unless they think it's pretty important. Legislators love to do it, but DLS as an institution doesn't necessarily love to do it.
Thank you. I would commit to have my team that is more knowledgeable on the details of it follow up with you and your colleagues and Andrew Gray.
Great. Let me ask one more before I turn to my colleagues, if that's all right. Going back to the special fund fees, you sort of made the point that the general funds, whatever you think long-term or certainly a short-term necessary gap filler, because we're not going to be able to raise fees in a short period of time. And you said you need thoughtful consideration. So can you just describe what the thoughtful consideration looks like? What processes has the department commenced to address that thoughtful consideration?
Well, thank you for that. So I know since I've been secretary, we have seen a steady and positive trend of reduced air emissions for our Title V air permits. And that's a good thing. The permit fees are based on volume and the amount of pollutants. So getting less from the polluter in a sense is good. It means that they're polluting less. So we need to be looking at different mechanisms to ensure that the air program, we've in the past, we have used settlement dollars like from the Volkswagen cheating scandal funds that we got. A way to look at funding, sustainable funding for permitting programs is to balance not only the polluter pays principle, which is extremely important, and we respect that principle, but also affordability, whether it's a citizen or a community or a business. And affordability in terms of water systems is a very important topic these days in the environmental justice discussions, water equity discussions. So one of the considerations, Mr. Chairman, in looking at new fees or increased fees is who's going to pay for something and how might they pay for it over time. The Wallman report many years ago made some recommendations about imposing new fees for certain types of water permits involving groundwater. That would certainly involve some important discussions with communities, with the agricultural users, with citizens. That's the type of thinking, the analysis we would need to use in terms of identifying new sources or new fees. And it's one that I think we should have carefully and through inclusion with the different stakeholders. One of the reasons why I really am enthused about the federal infrastructure funding, not just for the Chesapeake Bay, but for water and wastewater infrastructure around the state, is that we have seen impacts during the 2-year unprecedented pandemic. With the economy slowing down, it can often mean that we get less revenue for some of our permitting programs. And I think this funding, one of the reasons why the governor was so supportive of pushing through a bipartisan infrastructure law at the federal level, is that it would help provide a boost so that immediately after the pandemic, Marylanders weren't going to be stuck with an enormous new bill for some of the environmental programs. And last thing, Mr. Chairman, as I know you're familiar with, when we're talking about sustained funding for environmental and public health protection, we need to focus on polluter pays. We need to focus on public funding. But the third area is the Conservation Finance Act and other types of public-private partnerships where private sector funding can be used to supplement, not replace public funding or polluter pay funding. So that's an area that I'm encouraged by the progress that's being made in the General Assembly right now on additional funding sources for our water and wastewater and conservation-based funding needs.
Right. So I certainly get the concept that there are 10 polluters who are each being charged a fee, and 8 of them stop polluting. You're down to only 2 polluters being charged the fee. Now, that's a lot for the polluters to cover. On the other hand, presumably there's less work for MDE if there's less people polluting, although there still seems to be plenty of pollution. I guess each one of these probably requires a different level of analysis. I just don't think relying on the general fund is a long-term strategy. We're in the greatest budget year we're ever.
Oh, I don't either. I don't think it is a long-term strategy. There are a lot of important short-term measures that are taken when you're dealing with a public health and economic crisis. And I think from the environmental standpoint, this is viewed as a short-term measure. Polluter pays, public funding, and new partnerships for conservation finance are going to be very important components.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Secretary. So that's sort of exactly my point. You're getting where I am, which is I think each one of these probably needs to be looked at individually to understand why it's in its current condition and what the sort of, best future course of funding is. I'm a little concerned that thoughtful consideration, to use your phrase, isn't necessarily commenced yet. And so I think, we need to make sure we're jumpstarting that thoughtful consideration and not just relying on the general fund infusion. Great. Any other questions from my colleagues or comments? Great. Well, thank you again, Mr. Secretary, to you and your team. And I think some of us will see you, Wednesday.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Colleagues will now turn to the Maryland Department of Transportation, Office of the Secretary, and the analysis from Steve McCulloch. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Steve McCulloch with DLS, here to present the Secretary's Office of the Department of Transportation. Secretary's Office, or TSO, operating budget increases by $1.2 million over the current year. The PAYGO budget decreases by 5.7. We'll be talking a little bit more about the PAYGO program in a bit. Turning to the managing for results, every year I show the number of filled positions because vacancy rates can vary based on new positions or abolished positions. But the number of filled positions really tells you, how many people are in the jobs doing the work. As of January 1st of this year, across all of MDOT, there were 186 fewer filled positions than there were a year ago. Exhibit 2 shows the vacancy rates for the department over the past calendar year. So this is by month. And although I generally prefer the filled versus vacancy rate, since MDOT has not had any change in number of positions, this actually does accurately show the fact that the number of vacancies is increasing, and this shows it by mode. The black line here shows the departmental total, which is at 10% by the end of the year, which is still very good for a big department. Many other large agencies in the state have much higher rates, some of them double that rate. But it does show that even for the various modes of MDOT, that things have been increasing in terms of vacancies, and something that will need to be addressed by the agency. Exhibit 3 shows the system preservation funding. There is a goal in MFR that MDOT spend at least $850 million per year on system preservation. And this chart shows that they've met that since 2014 and are expected to more than meet that in the current year and fiscal 2023. One of the reasons 2023 looks much bigger is this topic of issue number 1 we'll get to in a minute. It talks about their new accounting method, a new system that allows them to capture more accurately that kind of spending. Looking at the agency spending, it is interesting for Secretary's office. It obviously is providing administrative support for the entire department. And as this pie chart shows, nearly half of the spending that TSO does is for the technology services that support the entire department. So nearly half, with departmental administration other than technology, accounting for another 33%, and operating grants and aid providing for the rest. As I mentioned at the beginning, the increase in the operating budget for the Secretary's office is $1.2 million. Personnel adds $1.3 million, largely driven, as you can see, by employee health insurance and turnover and hiring above the base. Administration of the department, there's some big puts at the top, but it actually decreases by a total of $1.8 million for rent. And this represents the paying off of the headquarters debt that was used to build the headquarters building. And then operating grants in aid to metropolitan organizations and other state and governmental organizations increase also over the year. Although finally, cost allocations, you can see a large decrease for paid telecommunications through the Department of Budget Management. So again, all of those puts and takes ends up in that $1.2 million increase over the current year. Exhibit 6 shows the operating grant and aid funding. This is largely the grants to the metropolitan planning organizations, with a large portion of that being federal funds and the state matching funds that go into that. The other area that drives the increase this year in operating grants and funding is this grant to the Maryland Department of Planning. It has been $400,000 for many years. However, up until fiscal 2023, this $400,000 was shared between the operating side of the TSO budget and the capital side. But the department did a review of how those funds were actually being spent, and it was decided that those were more appropriately all shown on the operating side. So there is an apparent increase in that grant. However, when you net it with the capital side of things, there's no increase. On personnel, there is 1/2 fewer positions due to an interdepartmental transfer. Overall, across the whole department, the number of regular positions does not increase or decrease from the current year. Turning now to the capital program for TSO, Exhibit 7 shows the 6-year funding for the Secretary's Office capital program by category. And you can see that through the end of the forecast period, there is currently an expectation of decreased capital funding. I will note that this is a fairly typical graph with things decreasing, where the current year and the planning year often will show larger amounts of funding. This is largely due to the fact that there are a lot of smaller projects that support the administration or the department as a whole, and they may not make it into the CTP in the out years, but as capital cash flow occurs with some other projects and other modes that free up funding, then TSO projects are ready to move in and be done as that funding allows. The allowance for Secretary's Office for fiscal 2023 totals $48 million. This shows the projects specifics at the top and program type funding on the bottom half, total costs for the projects, and then 6-year total for the Secretary's Office adds to $158.2 million. Exhibit 9 shows the cash flow, and this again kind of goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago. As introduced, the fiscal 2022 budget was smaller than the current working appropriation. There are this green bar shows some general funds. Transportation generally does not get general funds budgeted directly in the department. This represents funding approved in the supplemental budget last session for a grant to Prince George's County for infrastructure improvement to the blue line. But even absent that general fund addition, you can see that the special funds also increased. And again, as project cash flows and other modes freed up some funds, they were able to increase that for departmental projects. Exhibit 10 shows the cash flow, again, explaining in more detail that 2022 has introduced to the current year. Here are the additions to that. This, again, transportation infrastructure along the blue line, those are general funds that were added, which is not typically done. And then you see the other puts and takes to get to a total increase between the as introduced in the current year of $30.4 million. Exhibit 11 then compares the current year working appropriation with the allowance. And that, as I indicated at the beginning, decreases by $6.7 million. And you can see the puts and takes here. The accounting and reporting system modernization is a new project that came in for fiscal 2023. So that is a big addition. And then you can see this transportation along the blue line grant is a one-time grant. So that comes out in 2023. Exhibit 12 shows the changes to the construction program from last year's CTP, and the two items we've already talked about is the new accounting system and the also the transportation along the blue line corridor that was added in the supplemental budget last year. Turning now to the issues, the one issue raised in this analysis is to talk about the new capital management and planning system that MDOT implemented over the last several years, and it went live last year. Capital Management and Program System, or CMAPS, is the system they use to track all of their capital projects and information across the entire department, and it enables detailed tracking and reporting on the capital budget. Exhibit 13 shows an example of some of the new capability that this system is allowing MDOT to do. And Exhibit 13 shows the summary page in the CTP for the Transit Administration. And I selected the Transit Administration because it has, in all of the major categories, it has all of these subcategories that they are now reporting. And so this just shows that the level of granularity is much greater. And going forward, this will allow better transparency, really, in looking at how funds are allocated and spent in the department's capital program. Now, these subcategories, the department is calling investment categories, and this just gives a brief definition of each of these investment categories. And it's pretty self-explanatory. System preservation takes care of infrastructure they currently own. Expansion and efficiency are projects that either expand capacity or make it more efficient, safety, security, et cetera. I just note that local funding, that means that the funds are actually being given to a local jurisdiction, either a county or a municipality, or in this case, shown here, the WMATA grant is included in that category. Now, some of the projects obviously will hit more than one of these kind of investment categories. However, across the department, there is no double counting. So it is counted within the category that best or the majority of the project addresses. Exhibit 15 then shows what we can do by looking at these subcategories. This shows across the entire department the fiscal 2023 capital budget of $3.2 billion by these investment categories. And this shows very clearly that system preservation is the largest. Local funding, which includes both highway user and the WMATA grants, is a large portion. Shows that those not spent by the department directly, but given to other entities to spend. Turning now to the recommended actions, two recommended actions that are annual budget bill language. The first is to cap the level of special funds for operating grants and aid, unless the department provides information as to why they would like to increase that. And for the second recommendation on the PAYGO program is to restrict the funds for projects of more than $500,000, any changes without notification to the budget committees. I will just note that there is an annual update that is included. It's multiple pages, so I'm not going to go through it, but it could be of interest to members. This is for transit-oriented development projects, and each one is talked about that the department is currently working on, and it gives a little bit of background as to what the project entails, what has been worked on in the past year, and what is expected for the current year. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions for the analyst? Okay, I do not see any, so let me turn it over to Secretary of Ports and the Department of Transportation. Mr. Secretary.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jim Ports, Secretary for Maryland Department of Transportation. And today I also have with me Heather Murphy, the Director of Planning and Capital Programming, and Jacqueline Hartman, our Chief Financial Officer, to help answer any questions you may have. It's been a pleasure to be here to discuss the Secretary's office. As always, I want to thank Steve for his excellent work. I wish we could clone him. That would be illegal, but I wish we could. In the DLS analysis, we were asked to discuss factors that are contributing to a rise in vacancies across the department. First and foremost, I just want to thank all the more than 10,000 hardworking employees of MDOT and MDTA. These men and women are critical to our ability to operate and maintain a transportation network that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. They keep the network running in all weather conditions and throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So like many state agencies that you've heard about, we're facing some of the highest vacancy rates that we've had in years. It's important to note that we're just coming off a hiring freeze that lasted for more than a year, and vacancies crept up during that time frame. When the hiring freeze was lifted, we were faced with a job market where prospective employees are really in the driver's seat and are able to, be very selective about what jobs they take. We've been seeing fewer qualified applicants on applications, and that some of them want full-time telework, which obviously we can't usually offer due to the nature of our business. And even without the current job market environment, there are a lot of challenges to recruiting and retaining state employees. Over the years, as fiscal conditions changed, the pay and benefits for MDOT employees has been impacted. Pay for state employees has always been supplemented by generous benefit packages that the state offers, but those benefits have changed over the years, and they may not have the same value to job seekers. For example, pension reform brought a change to the state's vesting period from 5 to 10 years, but a lot of these newer employees don't plan to stay for 10 years. So it really isn't a benefit or value to them. In addition, many of the MDOT jobs are public facing, and those can be difficult to fill in a world where health concerns related to COVID-19 continue to be an important consideration in the way we interact with the world. Positions like customer service agents at the MVA, transit operators at MTA, and law enforcement positions are all impacted by this. Some of the jobs that are hardest for MDOT to fill are those where there is the most competition with the private sector or other public sector entities. For example, maintenance technicians, highly skilled trades, plumbers, electricians, information technology, emergency dispatchers, and accounting. And unfortunately, our human resources offices are not immune to the vacancies either. So as we lose personnel there, it makes recruitment across the board take longer. We recognize that the high vacancy rates creates more workload for employees that we do have, and we certainly don't want to over-rely on their hard work and dedication. With vacancy rates at these levels, it's going to take us some time to return to more normal staffing levels, but we are committed to continuing to focus on filling vacancies. The analysis also includes 2 recommended actions, both annual pieces of the budget bill language, and we concur with both. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions you or the members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any questions from the members? Okay, I have 2 that I think are relatively short. The first is I just want to flag for you that the department's had this great COVID-19 stat tracker showing monthly, sometimes weekly stats for the different modal units. And it seems to now be being updated inconsistently. So I would just ask you to take a look at that. It was frankly, absent COVID, I think it's sort of interesting to see the trends in traffic on all the different modes. So we'll just call that to your attention. I'm not sure you need to comment on that, although you're welcome to, obviously.
Well, I do get that report every week currently, so I don't know if it gets to you every week, but I've seen it every week.
So there's a public website, so I would just encourage
Okay.
the website be updated.
I'll check on that, Mr. Chairman. I didn't realize it wasn't on the public website. I'll definitely look into that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The second one is, and I don't want you to talk about, active litigation. I just, given the decision last week on the bid protest, just wanted to hear the sort of update about what that means on the I-270, I-495, P3 ops lane program.
Sure. So obviously the judge has made a ruling. We have not received that total ruling from the judge yet. So it's a little difficult to answer any questions specific to that ruling. Obviously, there are some reports from reporters. However, some of those are accurate, some of them are not so accurate. And so I don't want to judge anything off of the reports from reporters, but I'm waiting to see, and should probably receive it tomorrow, I would assume, the actual language and verbiage from the judge. And then from that point on, we'll obviously review it and then work with our attorneys, the AAGs, and then update you as we can, according to what we can say, as you mentioned, about an ongoing, judgment.
Okay. Great. Let me give my colleagues one more bite at the apple for any questions. I don't see any, Mr. Secretary. I guess the benefit of being before us every week is we get our questions out.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank you, colleagues. I believe that is it for us today. And I don't think we're meeting tomorrow. I think the full committee is meeting tomorrow. So with that, I believe we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Mhm.